October 1964, Eastern Kentucky. A narrow valley cut deep between two ridgelines that barely appeared on federal survey maps. The place had a local name, but in official paperwork, it was reduced to coordinates and elevation notes. That alone was not unusual. What was unusual was the classification level attached to a location that on paper contained nothing of value. The assignment originated from Fort Knox, routed through channels normally reserved for infrastructure failures or weapons testing sites. But this mission listed neither. No test designation, no operation name. Just a directive: survey, restrict access, and prepare the valley for closure. The unit deployed was small, recon-trained, engineering support attached, communications included. No heavy equipment, no public coordination. The paperwork emphasized discretion rather than speed. That detail mattered. According to later declassified fragments, the stated justification was geological instability. The valley floor sat above old limestone formations. Historical mining activity had weakened several sections of the gorge. A collapse was possible. That explanation appeared sufficient, until the details were examined. The valley had existed in that condition for decades. The mine had been inactive for years. No recent seismic activity had been recorded. No emergency reports had been filed. Yet the order was immediate and unusually specific about one thing. The valley was not to be entered by civilians again once the survey was complete. When the team arrived near dusk, the first inconsistency became apparent. The access road showed recent maintenance, fresh grading, cleared drainage. That work had not been logged in county records. Local authorities claimed no knowledge of it. There were houses visible from the ridge, older structures, modest, clearly occupied until recently. Porch lights still connected, smoke residue in chimneys. But no movement. No vehicles. No signs of evacuation convoys. The order, however, stated that the area had already been cleared. Recon teams are trained to notice when the environment does not match the briefing. That tension surfaced immediately. The terrain behaved normally in appearance, but not in measurement. Distances between landmarks exceeded what the maps indicated. Pace counts drifted. Elevation readings failed to align with visual slope. At first, this was dismissed as outdated mapping, but the charts carried the current year's print date. Communications checks produced another anomaly. Radios functioned, but background interference fluctuated unpredictably, even when stationary. The interference did not follow known signal patterns. It rose and fell without correlating to weather, movement, or transmission. None of this would have justified sealing a valley on its own. The civilian liaison arrived shortly after. He carried no visible credentials, no insignia. He did not issue commands, yet his presence altered decision flow. Requests routed through him were approved faster than those routed through command. He documented everything. He explained nothing. By nightfall, the team reached the upper ridge overlooking the valley floor. From that vantage, the layout should have been clear. Creek, road, abandoned structures, the mine entrance at the gorge. Instead, the geometry felt compressed. The bends in the creek appeared tighter than expected, the gorge narrower, the shadows deeper than terrain alone should produce. None of this was described as threatening. There was no panic, no sudden event. What unsettled the team was something more procedural. The land was not behaving like stable terrain under observation. Survey markers placed earlier appeared subtly misaligned when revisited. Not moved, not disturbed, simply offset. At that point, the mission logic inverted. The valley was not being sealed because it was unsafe to enter. It was being sealed because it resisted accurate documentation. That realization did not appear in any report. The official log for Day 1 concluded with a neutral phrase: "Area suitable for controlled closure, pending engineering assessment." But internally, a different question had already taken shape, one that would guide everything that followed. Why would a military unit be ordered to permanently restrict land that refused to stay measured? The valley that wouldn't clear. By the second day, the mission had shifted without any formal update. No new orders were issued, no changes logged, yet the team's behavior adjusted instinctively. Survey work slowed. Measurements were double-checked. Routes were retraced more often than doctrine required. The valley was supposed to be empty. That was the standing assumption. But emptiness has a pattern, and this place did not follow it. Structures near the lower road showed signs of recent use. Doors were unlocked but undamaged. Food remained, stored properly, not abandoned in haste. Clothing hung where it had been washed, not packed or discarded. Radios were unplugged, not smashed. This was not the aftermath of evacuation under pressure. It looked more like people had stepped away, with the expectation of returning. Local authorities insisted relocation had been voluntary, quiet, cooperative, yet no transport records existed, no assistance requests, no documentation of compensation. The absence of paperwork was as notable as the absence of people. As the team moved deeper, the environmental inconsistencies multiplied. Creek depth varied at identical crossings. A shallow ford measured knee-high in the morning, registered mid-thigh by afternoon without rain. Soil firmness changed within meters, dry and compact in one step, soft and unsettled in the next. Engineering readings began to diverge from visual reality. Elevation tools showed minimal change, while physical exertion increased. Slopes that should have registered steep climbs produced flat data. It was as if the valley resisted being plotted in 3 dimensions. The civilian liaison remained present, observing without interference. He recorded anomalies but offered no interpretation. When asked whether prior teams had encountered similar issues, he answered indirectly. He said only that previous assessments had been inconclusive. That phrasing mattered. Midday, the team reached what remained of the old company town. Its layout suggested long-term habitation, rail spur, processing remnants, housing clusters. But the town felt unfinished, as if it had been abandoned in stages rather than all at once. Some buildings had collapsed naturally. Others showed recent reinforcement, fresh boards over old windows, new nails in rotted frames. Inside one structure, survey notes were found on a work table. They were not military. The handwriting was uneven, the measurements crude, but the content was unsettling. Lines radiated outward from a central point near the gorge. Distances were marked in irregular increments, not feet or yards, just spacing. Those spacings matched, roughly, the intervals where the team's own measurements began to fail. The notes were photographed, then removed from the site record. Further along the creek, chalk markings appeared on interior walls of a collapsed building. Not symbols in any recognized system, not warnings. They resembled diagrams, curved lines layered over one another, adjusted repeatedly, as if someone had tried to redraw the valley from memory and failed each time. The markings were older than the dust around them. At this stage, the assumption that civilians had simply refused relocation no longer held. The evidence suggested something else. People had been attempting to map the valley on their own terms. Communications issues worsened by late afternoon. Radio hiss intensified when approaching the gorge, then receded when moving away. The fluctuation followed geography, not equipment. Signal checks confirmed hardware was functioning normally. One technician noted that the interference pattern did not behave randomly. It repeated, slowly, almost rhythmically. That observation was not included in the formal log. As dusk approached, movement was reported along the far ridge. Not figures, not animals, just shifts in shadow that followed the same path more than once. Binoculars revealed nothing distinct. Thermal equipment showed no heat signatures. The movement was acknowledged, then dismissed as low-light distortion. Yet when the team relocated their observation post, the path chosen by those shadows aligned precisely with a natural saddle the engineers had already marked as a potential choke point. Coincidence was noted. Correlation was not. By nightfall, the question of whether to seal the valley was no longer under discussion. The focus had narrowed to how quickly it could be done. Engineering estimates were revised upward. More material would be needed. More structural collapse, more permanence. The language in the planning documents subtly changed. Restricted area became long-term closure. Hazard mitigation became containment protocol. No one used the word containment aloud, but the intent was becoming clear. The valley was not failing structurally. It was failing to remain fixed, on maps, in measurements, in records. And whatever could not be fixed could not be managed, only isolated. By the end of day 2, the mission objective had quietly crystallized. Seal the valley, not because it was dangerous to enter, but because it refused to stay defined, once observed. When the numbers stopped agreeing. The third day began with confirmation that something had shifted overnight, even though no movement had been recorded. An outer observation post failed to report in at first light. Communications were attempted on primary and secondary channels. Equipment checks confirmed transmission capability. There was no response. When the team reached the position, nothing appeared disturbed. The shelter was intact. Gear was arranged correctly. Rifles leaned against a tree, muzzles down, exactly as protocol required during rest periods. Helmets rested beside them. Bedrolls lay empty. There were no tracks leading away. The soil held impressions from the previous day's setup, but nothing beyond that point. It was as if the men had stood up and vanished without crossing the ground between moments. The incident was logged as a terrain-related loss. That classification was unusual, but not unprecedented in unstable regions. What made it stand out was how quickly it was accepted by higher authority. No recovery order was issued, no expansion of search parameters. The civilian liaison documented the site carefully. Then he instructed the team to continue their survey. That decision marked a turning point. From that point forward, measurement errors increased in frequency and scale. Distance readings stretched beyond acceptable tolerance. Timekeeping devices began to diverge. Watches worn by different members lost minutes at unequal rates, even when synchronized earlier that morning. The discrepancies were small but cumulative. Over hours, they became impossible to reconcile. Engineering tools produced stable outputs, but the environment did not match them. A ridge measured at a consistent elevation felt longer to climb with each ascent. A creek bend mapped as shallow deepened unpredictably when approached from different angles. The valley no longer behaved as a static environment. Midday, evidence surfaced that the area was not as empty as Command believed. Fresh footprints were discovered along the rail line leading toward the gorge. They were clear, recent, and deliberate. The prints followed the tracks precisely, then ended beneath an abandoned rail car. There were no exit marks, no disturbance around the car. Nothing to indicate where the person had gone next. Later, a small campsite was found in the upper hollows. It was organized, maintained, food stored properly. Fire remained still warm. Whoever had stayed there understood the land and had left calmly. Nearby, a crude arrangement of wire, bone fragments, and scrap metal had been hung from a tree facing the gorge. It was not decorative. It was not random. It appeared functional, positioned intentionally, aligned with sight lines into the valley. The civilian liaison examined it closely, but did not allow it to be removed. By afternoon, reports of environmental response increased. Subtle tremors passed through the ridge without seismic signature. Not enough to register as an earthquake, just enough to be felt underfoot. The ground behaved less like inert stone and more like a structure under internal pressure. Near the mine entrance, the air changed. A faint vibration could be sensed rather than heard, strongest at the narrowest part of the gorge. Radio interference intensified, there, layering into repeating patterns. Signal operators described it as structured noise. No explanation was provided. Against standing orders, a brief perimeter inspection of the mine was conducted. The team did not enter deeply. Even at the threshold, something was wrong. Old mounting brackets were found embedded in the stone, older than the mine itself. Not mining hardware, not reinforcement. Something installed during a previous phase of use. One rusted strip of metal bore hand-scratched notation beneath layers of corrosion. The notation referenced a successful breach. The context was missing. The phrase stood alone. The civilian liaison terminated the inspection immediately. That night, the valley grew unnaturally quiet. Insects fell silent. Wind movement diminished. The faint vibration remained, steady and patient, barely detectable unless one stopped moving. Shadows appeared again along the far ridge. They followed the same routes as before. Not erratic, not exploratory. Consistent, as if tracing boundaries that only they could perceive. No engagement occurred. No lights. No sound. At that point, the mission ceased to be about surveying. It became about scheduling closure. Engineers were notified to prepare for immediate deployment. Explosive estimates were increased. The gorge was designated the primary seal point. Internally, the logic had inverted completely. The missing men were no longer considered recoverable. The civilians deeper in the valley were no longer considered residents. The environment itself was no longer treated as passive. The valley was now categorized as an active variable. And active variables, once identified, are not studied indefinitely. They are isolated, neutralized, or buried. By the end of day 3, one conclusion dominated internal discussion, though it never appeared in writing. Whatever was happening in the valley did not escalate when observed. It escalated when measured. The decision to close the gorge. The 4th day began with a change in tone rather than orders. No new briefing was delivered, yet everyone understood that recovery was no longer the priority. The missing personnel from the observation post were reclassified as unrecoverable due to terrain instability. The wording was clinical, final. It closed a door that had not been openly discussed before. Engineering units were en route. The valley responded before they arrived. Shortly after dawn, a low tremor passed through the ground. Not abrupt, not violent. It moved slowly beneath the surface, like pressure shifting through deep stone. Survey markers placed the previous evening were still upright, but their spacing no longer matched recorded measurements. The creek had altered its path again, only slightly, but enough to invalidate earlier depth readings. The water cut tighter against the gorge wall, narrowing the natural corridor that engineers had already identified as the primary seal point. This was not erosion. It was adjustment. The civilian liaison made several transmissions on a restricted channel. The content was not shared. When he finished, he informed the team that the closure timeline had been accelerated. The valley would be sealed within 72 hours, regardless of remaining uncertainties. At that moment, containment ceased to be a theoretical outcome. It became a directive. The team was ordered to conduct one final sweep toward the gorge, not to recover anything, but to confirm no personnel remained in the immediate blast radius. The distinction was subtle, but important. As they advanced, environmental resistance increased. Distances stretched again. Slopes required more effort without corresponding elevation change. Timekeeping drift became noticeable without comparison. Watches felt slow even without reference. Near a rock shelf overlooking the gorge, a canteen was discovered. It belonged to one of the missing men. The metal was clean, no damage. It had been placed deliberately, not dropped. The location made no tactical sense as a cache point. The find was logged. No search expansion followed. Closer to the gorge, the air thickened. The faint vibration that had been present since the first night sharpened into something more pronounced. It did not register as sound. It was perceived as pressure, subtle, steady, present in the chest more than the ears. Radio interference intensified into repeating patterns. Operators described it as rhythmic, though no one could explain what it was repeating. At the gorge itself, the terrain narrowed further. Wind funneled through the rock walls in uneven pulses. The creek below twisted in a way that no longer matched any recorded map. Engineers later confirmed that the curvature exceeded what the surrounding geology should allow. The gorge looked wrong. As the team moved along the edge, the ground shifted again. A stronger tremor rolled through the stone, dislodging loose debris. Dust fell in slow sheets. A second tremor followed, sharper and more localized. The rock face above the narrowest section fractured. A partial collapse occurred without warning. Stone slid forward and dropped, sealing a section of the path behind the team. Not a full closure, just enough to cut off the return route they had used minutes earlier. The timing was precise. They moved forward toward a shallow recess formed by the collapse, assuming it was a natural pocket. Inside, they found two of the missing men. Both were alive. They were not injured. They were not restrained. They were kneeling, facing the stone, still and silent, as if listening. Their breathing was slow and synchronized. When spoken to, they reacted sluggishly, blinking as if waking from deep concentration rather than fear. Extraction was difficult. Their coordination was impaired. They moved reluctantly, not resisting, but not assisting either. Only when they were guided beyond a certain bend did their awareness begin to return. Behind them, the vibration intensified. The civilian liaison observed the extraction without comment. He made another transmission once the men were clear of the gorge. Afterward, he confirmed what had already become inevitable. The closure would proceed immediately. The rescue did not alter the plan. That night, the valley grew tense. Not active, not hostile, poised. The faint vibration no longer faded in and out. It remained constant, threading through the still air. Across the ridge, shadows moved once more. Faster now, more numerous, still silent, still distant. The engineers arrived at first light the next morning. The window for reversal had closed. The decision to seal the gorge was no longer a response to instability. It was a preemptive measure against something that had demonstrated awareness of observation, proximity, and timing. And awareness, once confirmed, changes how the military defines terrain. The seal was not the end. The engineering convoy reached the valley just after sunrise. Their arrival altered the soundscape immediately. Engines echoed through the ridgelines. Metal equipment struck stone. Voices carried farther than expected. The valley absorbed the disturbance without resistance, but not without response. Several engineers paused near the gorge without being prompted. They checked their radios. One adjusted his headset twice before saying anything. None of them could articulate what felt wrong. They only agreed that something felt present. The sealing operation began with methodical precision. Charges were placed along pre-marked choke points. Wire barriers were staged behind the primary collapse zone. Secondary slide paths were prepared to ensure long-term inaccessibility. On paper, it was a straightforward geological mitigation task. In practice, the terrain resisted finality. Drilling teams reported inconsistent rock density. Bits dulled faster than expected in some sections, and passed through too easily in others. Measurements confirmed the holes were being placed correctly, yet the spacing between them felt wider when walked than when measured. The civilian liaison monitored every placement. He carried a small instrument, not listed on any inventory. When pressed, he identified it only as a monitoring device. Its needle moved in response to the same faint vibration that now permeated the gorge. The vibration strengthened as the work progressed. It did not spike during drilling. It increased during pauses, during observation. At mid-morning, another tremor passed through the gorge. This one lasted longer than the previous events. Stone groaned under stress. The creek surged briefly, then settled into a new channel tighter against the rock wall. No one ordered a stop. The work continued. As the final charges were set, the air grew noticeably heavier. Not humid, not dense, simply resistant. Movement felt slower, as if the valley exerted a mild opposing force on motion. Radio interference reached its peak. Static layered into repeating cycles that operators described as structured, not chaotic. When frequencies were adjusted, the pattern persisted. The engineers were not briefed on earlier anomalies. Even so, several asked whether the site had been used for testing before. The question went unanswered. By early afternoon, the sealing sequence was ready. The team withdrew to higher ground. From there, the gorge was fully visible. The narrow throat appeared darker than the surrounding stone, absorbing light unevenly. The creek below reflected no clear sky, only fragmented lines. Before detonation, a low vibration rolled through the valley, stronger than any prior event. Dust drifted from ridges far beyond the blast zone. Trees swayed without wind. The timing was again precise. The charges fired in sequence. The sound was not sharp. It was deep, layered, and prolonged. Stone folded inward. The gorge collapsed under controlled force, but the effect exceeded projections. Massive slabs slid into place, sealing the narrow passage completely. The creek was diverted instantly. Its old curve vanished beneath debris. When the dust settled, the gorge no longer resembled a failure point. It looked permanent, ancient, as if the seal had always been part of the land. The vibration diminished rapidly after the collapse, not gradually, abruptly. Within minutes, the structured interference on radios faded into normal static. The air felt lighter. Movement felt unopposed. Something had changed. Engineers inspected the debris field. The collapse was stable, more stable than expected. Secondary slide paths activated naturally without detonation, reinforcing the seal without additional intervention. From a containment perspective, the operation was flawless. Yet the valley did not return to normal. Structures in the company town showed subtle shifts. Doors previously closed stood open. Curtains moved without wind. Paths that had not been walked in days showed fresh disturbance, but no footprints. The civilians who had avoided relocation were gone. No signs of departure, no camps remaining, no trails leading out. They had not crossed the sealed gorge. By evening, fencing crews began staging materials along the access road. Warning signage was prepared. Federal designation paperwork was already complete. The speed suggested the outcome had never been in doubt. The civilian liaison made his final transmission before nightfall. He used the same restricted channel. His report was brief. When he finished, he packed his equipment and departed without acknowledging the team. That night, the valley was silent. No vibration, no interference, no movement on the ridges. But the silence did not feel empty. It felt contained. The seal had not erased whatever altered the valley's behavior. It had interrupted it, interrupted observation, interrupted access, interrupted response. From a logistical standpoint, the mission was complete. From an analytical standpoint, something else had begun. Because the environment no longer reacted to measurement, it simply waited. What remained? After closure. The valley was formally reclassified within 48 hours of the sealing operation. The designation used neutral language, restricted federal land due to environmental instability. Maps were updated quickly. Access roads were removed from public routing. What remained on civilian charts was an unremarkable green fold between ridgelines, labeled only by elevation and drainage. No mention was made of a gorge. No mention of a mine. No mention of personnel losses. The engineering units departed first. Their reports were brief and unusually confident. The collapse was described as stable beyond expectation. Long-term erosion risk was assessed as minimal. Follow-up inspections were deemed unnecessary. Fencing crews followed, then signage, then silence. The recon team returned to Fort Knox, under orders that emphasized discretion rather than secrecy. There were no non-disclosure forms, no explicit threats. Instead, there was procedural erasure. Notes were collected, logs were standardized. Measurements that did not align were corrected to match baseline surveys. Where numbers could not be reconciled, they were omitted. The missing observation post personnel were officially listed as lost during routine field activity in unstable terrain. No recovery attempt was recorded after the closure. Their names appeared once in a regional casualty summary, then nowhere else. The rescued men were evaluated, cleared, and reassigned. No long-term medical flags were placed in their files. Yet those who served alongside them noted subtle changes. Timekeeping habits became rigid. Spatial awareness drifted. One refused assignments involving underground structures. Another transferred out within the year, without explanation. None of that entered the record. The civilian liaison did not appear in any after-action documentation. His presence was implied only by routing codes and approval timestamps that outranked local command authority. When inquiries were made, they led nowhere. His role was never denied. It was simply undefined. Within a month, the valley ceased to exist as a subject of discussion. Local press published a single article referencing a landslide risk and voluntary relocation. No interviews were conducted. No photographs were printed. The location was not named. The story faded within days. From the outside, the operation was clean. From the inside, it left a residue. Those who had worked inside the valley described a persistent awareness long after leaving. Not fear, not trauma, something closer to recalibration. Distances elsewhere felt more precise. Maps felt more rigid. Terrain behaved predictably again. And that predictability felt newly noticeable. Several reported that radio sounded different for a time, cleaner, emptier. Years later, follow-up satellite imagery showed no unusual activity. Vegetation reclaimed the access routes. The sealed gorge blended into the ridgeline. The creek maintained its diverted path without deviation. Geologically, the site stabilized exactly as projected. What never returned were the inconsistencies. No further measurement drift was recorded in adjacent regions. No radio interference patterns resurfaced. No unexplained personnel incidents occurred in similar terrain nearby. It was as if the anomaly, whatever its nature, had been isolated precisely to the boundaries that were closed. Internally, the operation was never labeled a failure or a success. It was categorized as resolved. That word appeared repeatedly in subsequent classification summaries, even though no causal explanation had been documented. Resolved did not mean understood. Resolved meant inactive. In later years, requests to reopen the area for environmental study were denied without justification. Proposals to resurvey the sealed gorge were quietly declined. There was no appeal process because no denial was formally issued. The land remained untouched. Those who participated aged out of service. Their memories softened around the edges, except for one persistent detail shared independently by several of them. They all recalled the same sensation during the final moments before detonation. Not alarm, not urgency, but timing. The impression that the valley recognized when observation would end. Not reacted, recognized. After the seal, that awareness vanished, or withdrew, or ceased to interact. No follow-on operations were ever required. The military does not typically abandon usable land without reason. Training areas are repurposed. Restricted zones are reclassified. Even contaminated sites are revisited. This valley was not. It remained closed, not because it was dangerous, but because it no longer responded. And environments that stop responding after intervention are not treated as mysteries. They are treated as variables successfully contained. The final report concluded with a single line that attracted no attention at the time. No further action recommended unless environmental behavior changes. It has not, and that, more than anything else, explains why the valley remains sealed.